Today's review comes at a request from a Rev Reads viewer who sent me the book in the mail. This review covers Henry Morris's God and the Nations, what the Bible has to say about civilizations, past and present. This is a fascinating book, not primarily for Morris's insight into the biblical record, but for more Henry Morris doing the work of tying together and then bringing into one relatively brief book the Bible's teachings regarding the nations. One thing I think we can lose sight of, both because we are currently in the church age and because of the replacement theology present throughout the church, is how much of the Bible is Israel centric. It is about Abraham's descendants, God's promises to them, and the land that was set apart for them. So it's not often that we get a study, and I don't know if I've ever read one before this book, where the author pulls together all of the passages relating to the nations and then ties together the narrative on the nations from the beginning to end on how God relates to them, those who are not Israel. I think this is a very important and underappreciated work in biblical theology. You could say that this book is a theology on the nations as recorded in Scripture, one that dispensationalists will appreciate, and those who hold to replacement theology and believe that the church is Israel, people will probably find this book to be kind of pointless. But let me tell you some of the interesting points in God and the Nations by the late Henry Morris. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to learn about the grand story of how God relates to all those made in his image, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with the most current reviews. And also, please like and share this video to help others know about the work of Henry Morris. Henry Morris founded the Institute for Creation Research and wrote many books on a young earth or books on various other theological topics. Morris has a strong focus on the importance of Genesis 1 through 11 for the biblical narrative. And that focus is very important for a book on the nations. Morris writes on how God's purpose for the nations was to prepare them for eternity. The nations don't only hold a function in these time periods, but God has plans for the nations up to the end of days. So Morris begins this book with the establishment of the nations at Babel and then works his way forward in the biblical narrative. And one of the interesting things about the Tower of Babel story, that while it is a short account there in the beginning of Genesis, is just how important that moment is to the entire narrative structure. And also what's interesting is how God took what was a judgment, the separation of the world's population into various languages and people groups, and used that judgment for his own glory and for our benefit, as the diversity of nations ends up being for our good. And it is something that is going to continue into the kingdom of Jesus Christ. You even have passages such as Romans 1:21, which is probably looking back to the time before Babel, as well as Acts 17:26 through 28, which is probably looking back to the specific event that was the Tower of Babel. It even seems as if in the way that Paul writes about those time periods, that Paul has an assumption that all Gentiles and Jews should be able to look back to a singular history that went back to the Tower of Babel. And so that's what he could be referencing when he's speaking to both Jews and Gentiles alike. Morris discusses how our own time in this book and how the nations today fit into the biblical narrative, which again goes back to earlier passages of Scripture, such as the dominion mandate, the establishment of the death penalty in the days of Noah, and then the spreading out of the nations at Babel. And he looks at how the role for the church, we in the church today are not to control the nations, but our role today is to be a witness to all the nations of the world when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I really appreciated his writings on natural theology in this book. Natural theology is the view that we can use nature to draw people to faith in God. And he had an interesting point at one place in this section on how various aspects of creation point to the triune nature of God. For example, he discussed space, matter, and time among various triunities in creation and showed how they pointed to some objects in creation being proofs to God's nature or existence as the triune God. And he also did point out how it's true that none of these alone by themselves will point to God's nature, but there are all these little breadcrumbs that are out there in science, in nature, that are found that can lead people to a knowledge of the God of Scripture. A rather large portion of the book is set aside to the importance of evangelizing the nations today. There's one chapter on witness to the Gentiles and another on the missionary mandate. Morris was able to clearly see and place an emphasis on the importance of this time when it comes to the nations. What's the crucial part of the nations right now is that the church needs to be sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. It's not that the church itself is to be a nation or a kingdom now, but our role is to be in the midst of all the nations, in the midst of all the kingdoms, sharing with them the good news of Jesus Christ. He ends the book with what I believe is an important note, and that is the nations are included for God's plan in the end of days. There will still be Egyptians and Assyrians and more nations in the millennial kingdom and the new heavens and the new earth. The nations aren't going to fade out of existence once Christ arrives and we're going to become one nation that is the church, but the diversity of nations will continue even into the final state. We have a God who clearly loves diversity, and that's even seen in God's love for the nation. For the most part, this was a good, straightforward walk through the Bible. Now, there are a few places where I disagreed with Morris, such as Morris presenting Abraham as a believer in God at the beginning of his journey in Genesis, while I think Joshua makes it clear that Abraham and his parents were polytheists at the beginning of the story, and Abraham develops into a faith in Yahweh as the only creator God and his personal God as we go through Genesis 12 through 14. And I have a few other minor issues like his interpretation of the Sabbath becoming a weekly day for rest and worship in the church. I don't believe Sunday for Christians is a new version of the Sabbath, but from the Sabbath, we do learn the principle of the importance of rest and worship. We just don't translate that into a law for us today. We should make clear that we aren't resting through obedience to Moses' law. Overall, if you want to know how the nations relate to Israel and the part that the nations play in God's story, a really good place to start is Henry Morris's work, God and the Nations.